My boyfriend threw acid in my mother's face. Mason threw industrial cleaning solution in my mother's face during what was supposed to be my college graduation dinner. The restaurant erupted into absolute chaos as my mother collapsed screaming while her skin literally bubbled and peeled away from her skull. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't comprehend what Mason had just done. My father tackled him to the ground, punching him repeatedly. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't work as I watched my mother's face dissolve. "She's been stealing Beatrice's identity for 3 years," Mason shouted while trying to shield himself from my father's fists, as 2 of my uncles jumped in to help restrain him, all of them slipping in the blood spreading across the floor. "She's been using their identical resemblance to drain her bank accounts." I was barely listening. My legs gave out and I crashed into a chair, but my father hesitated for just a second, his fist raised in the air, and Mason spit blood onto the floor while my mother rolled and thrashed, knocking over chairs and leaving smears of flesh on everything she touched. "I have video of her at 5 different banks," he yelled over my mother's inhuman screaming, holding the screen up while my uncle twisted his arm. "I noticed discrepancies in Beatrice's accounts when we were apartment hunting and installed tracking software, and I've caught her mother stealing $40,000. My mother writhed on the floor and tried to speak, but only managed to spray blood across the white tablecloth, while her face continued to dissolve. And even through the destroyed flesh, I could see something in that look that made my stomach drop because it wasn't denial. It was rage at being caught. "Those accounts are family money," she finally shrieked through her melted mouth, the words barely human. "Mom?" I whispered, but I couldn't hear my own voice over the chaos of people screaming and crying and calling 911, while my mother's face kept bubbling and peeling like plastic in a fire. My father grabbed the phone from Mason with hands covered in my mother's blood and skin, staring at the screen where my mother was clearly at an ATM wearing my clothes, and his face went white. "Linda, you've been stealing from our daughter?" he asked while she convulsed on the floor, her screaming never stopping. "She owes me everything." My mother managed to hiss between shrieks of agony, blood and tissue dripping onto the floor. "I gave up my career to raise her." The other diners were pressed against the walls filming everything while the manager was vomiting in the corner and servers were sobbing, and I felt like I was drowning because my own mother had been systematically destroying my future while her face was literally falling off in front of me. "You destroyed her face over money?" My father shouted at Mason, releasing him and stumbling backward, slipping in the puddle of blood and chemicals. "Even if she stole from Beatrice, you threw acid at my wife." Mason wiped blood from his broken nose and looked directly at me with an expression that made my blood freeze. "That's not why I had to destroy her face." Everyone went silent except for my mother's whimpering and the sound of her skin sizzling, and I heard myself ask, "What do you mean that's not why?" "I followed her to a P.O. box yesterday," Mason said quietly. "Check her purse." My mother started shrieking even louder and trying to crawl toward her bag, leaving a trail of dissolved flesh, but my father got there first and dumped it onto the floor where a small glass vial rolled out. "That's ricin," Mason said, his voice deadly calm now while chaos continued around us. "She was going to poison Beatrice at the mother-daughter spa trip next week, and then completely take over her life." I vomited onto the white tablecloth. "You were supposed to die quietly," my mother screamed at me through the soup of her face. "After you were gone, I was going to be you, live as you, graduate medical school as you, because we're identical, and nobody would ever know the difference." "She's already been preparing," Mason gasped, blood still streaming from where my father had beaten him while sirens wailed outside. "She's memorized all of Beatrice's friends' names. She's been recording Beatrice's voice to practice matching it. She's already redirected Beatrice's mail to that P.O. box, changed the emergency contacts at the medical school to only herself." My father dropped to his knees in the pool of blood. "I had to destroy her face," Mason said, looking at me desperately as police burst through the door with weapons drawn. "It was the only way to make sure she could never pretend to be you again." The paramedics rushed to my mother while police grabbed Mason. "Wait!" I screamed, but they were already dragging him toward the door while my mother shrieked from the stretcher. "There's more, Beatrice!" Mason yelled as they pulled him away, struggling against the officers. "About your father, about what she's been doing to him too." The police started shouting for everyone to stay back while more sirens screamed outside, and suddenly there were officers everywhere pulling us apart and pushing witnesses against the walls. A cop in heavy gear grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the table while another one was yelling about hazmat protocols and the rice and vial Mason mentioned. They wouldn't let me near my father or uncles and kept asking if I touched anything while someone else was bagging everything on our table, including the plates and glasses and my purse. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely stand, and when they asked my name, I had to try 3 times before the words came out right. The hazmat team rushed in wearing those white suits and masks, and started putting yellow tape everywhere while photographing the blood and chemical burns on the floor. They made us all strip down to our underwear right there in the restaurant and gave us paper suits to wear while bagging our clothes for testing. I watched them seal my graduation dress in plastic and label it as evidence while my mother's screams got fainter as they wheeled her out. A woman with short gray hair and a badge walked up to me and said she was Detective Caitlin Haynes, the lead investigator on this case. She explained they had to process the whole scene before taking our full statements. but she wanted me to know she'd be handling everything. Her voice was calm and steady, which helped me focus on something besides the smell of burned flesh still hanging in the air. She told me the restaurant would stay closed with crime scene tape while they collected evidence, and that I'd need to come to the station later. The paramedics loaded my mother into an ambulance with burn specialists while Detective Haynes arranged for me to go to the hospital for decontamination. They put me in a separate ambulance, and the EMT kept checking my skin for any chemical burns while we drove to the emergency room. At the hospital, they made me shower 3 times with special soap and checked every inch of my skin with some kind of light. The nurses were nice and kept telling me I was safe now, but I felt like I was watching someone else go through all this. My father showed up still covered in blood and chemicals, and they rushed him into decontamination too, while I sat in a paper gown waiting. About an hour later, a man in a dark suit showed up and introduced himself as Agent Joshua Carr from the FBI. He explained that finding ricin made this a federal case involving attempted murder and chemical weapons possession. He said my graduation dinner was now a federal crime scene and they'd be taking over parts of the investigation. Detective Haynes came to the hospital and started asking me questions about Mason and our relationship, and any money problems I'd noticed recently. I told her about apartment hunting last month, and how Mason kept asking about my bank statements, and seemed worried about discrepancies. She wrote everything down in a small notebook, and kept asking about specific dates and times, and what exactly Mason said. Agent Carr came back and explained they had to test the vial at a federal lab to confirm it was actually ricin. He said the chain of custody had to be perfect for any future court case, and kept asking where my mother might have gotten it. He seemed really interested in whether she had any chemistry knowledge or access to laboratories. Detective Haynes had me sign a bunch of consent forms allowing them to look at my bank records and email accounts to verify the identity theft. She warned me they'd probably find more violations than what Mason discovered and said I should prepare myself for that. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pen, and my signature looked nothing like normal. My father was sitting in the hospital waiting room when I got out, and he kept switching between being mad at Mason and shocked about my mother. He kept repeating that she was his wife, like saying it enough times would make this make sense somehow. The burn surgeon came out and said my mother was in critical condition, and we couldn't visit yet because of infection risk. Detective Haynes sat down with us and explained that Mason would face aggravated assault charges at minimum, but probably attempted murder. She said my mother would face federal charges for the ricin and state charges for identity theft and attempted murder if she survived. The legal stuff was so complicated I couldn't follow half of it, even though she tried to explain it simply. My uncles showed up and said they'd drive me home since I was shaking too much to drive myself. The ride was silent except for the radio playing some stupid pop song that felt wrong after everything that happened. When we got to my apartment, everything looked different, even though nothing had changed since this morning. Every photo of my mother and me on the walls felt fake now, like props in someone else's life. I kept staring at one from my high school graduation where we looked so much alike people called us twins. My uncles wanted to stay, but I told them I needed to be alone even though the apartment felt too quiet and empty. I sat on my couch still wearing the hospital scrubs they gave me and tried to understand how my mother could plan to kill me. The woman who taught me to ride a bike and braided my hair for school had been stealing from me for 3 years. She'd been practicing my voice and memorizing my friends and planning to poison me at a spa where I'd trust her completely. Mason knew somehow and decided destroying her face was the only way to save me from being replaced. My phone kept buzzing with messages from people who heard something happened, but I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. I got up to get water, and that's when I saw the yellow envelope on my kitchen counter that I definitely didn't put there. My hands shook as I picked it up and read the mail forwarding confirmation from USPS dated 6 days ago. The new address was a P.O. box across town, and my signature at the bottom looked perfect, except I never signed this. I grabbed my phone and called my bank while my legs gave out, and I slid down the cabinet to sit on the floor. The customer service person put me on hold 3 times before finally confirming 4 unauthorized withdrawals in the past month. Each one was just under the reporting limit, and they all happened at branches I never visited. I hung up and called the fraud department, who walked me through freezing everything while I sat there on my kitchen floor. The credit card company found 3 cards I didn't open with charges at stores near that P.O. box. Every call made it worse, and I kept having to spell my name and social security number over and over. By the 3rd bank, I was crying again because the violations kept adding up. The medical school number was saved in my phone, and I stared at it for 10 minutes before calling. The administrator answered on the 2nd ring, and I managed to explain about a family emergency and criminal investigation without saying my mother tried to kill me. She transferred me to the dean's office where I had to repeat everything while trying not to sob. They said they understood and would email the deferral paperwork, but I could hear the confusion in their voices. 4 years of perfect attendance, and now I was asking for emergency leave right before starting rotations. The paperwork came through while I was still on the floor, and seeing my future on hold made me throw up in the kitchen sink. My phone started ringing with a number I didn't recognize, and when I didn't answer, it immediately rang again. The voicemail said they were from Channel 7 News and wanted to discuss the restaurant incident. I deleted it, but then Channel 4 called, and then some blogger, and then numbers I didn't even recognize. My Facebook was already blowing up with messages from people I barely knew asking if that was really my family in the video. I deactivated everything while more calls came in and changed my voicemail to say I wasn't available. The Instagram comments were worse, with strangers saying horrible things about my mother's face and making jokes about acid attacks. Someone had tagged me in the original video, and now everyone from high school was sharing it. I knew I shouldn't look, but I found the video on Twitter with over 50,000 views already. My mother's screaming filled my apartment, and I watched her face bubble and peel while she admitted she wanted to become me. The comments said we deserved it, or that Mason was a hero, or that the whole thing was fake. People were arguing about whether throwing acid was justified if someone was planning murder. I made it to the bathroom before throwing up this time, but I could still hear her voice from the video. Detective Haynes had given me her card and told me not to watch anything online, but I couldn't stop myself. She answered when I called and said she needed me to write down everything I remembered about the attack. She wanted dates and times and any strange behavior from my mother that I might have dismissed. I got a notebook and started writing, but my hand kept cramping from gripping the pen too tight. The list started with her insisting on having copies of all my apartment keys for emergencies, then asking detailed questions about my class schedule and which professors I had. She memorized my friends' birthdays and their parents' names, which seemed sweet at the time. The way she'd practice my laugh when she thought I wasn't listening. How she bought the same perfume and started wearing her hair exactly like mine. She asked about my passwords for everything, saying she needed them in case something happened to me. The list filled 3 pages, and I was only up to last year. That night I tried to sleep, but kept seeing her melted face every time I closed my eyes. The smell of chemicals seemed stuck in my nose even though I'd showered 3 times. I got up and paced from the living room to the bedroom over and over. The apartment was too quiet, but turning on the TV might mean seeing the video again. I checked the locks 4 times and moved a chair in front of the door. My sheets were soaked with sweat when I tried lying down again. Her voice saying I owed her everything kept repeating in my head. I paced until my feet hurt and then kept pacing anyway. The sun came up and I was still walking back and forth like some kind of broken robot. My phone had 17 missed calls and I was scrolling through them when I saw Mason's name. The voicemail was from yesterday morning at 7:43 hours before the dinner. His voice sounded different, scared and talking fast about needing to tell me something about my mother. He said he'd found something terrible and I needed to know before the dinner. He begged me to call him back immediately and said he was sorry for what he might have to do. The message cut off mid-sentence like he ran out of time. Detective Haynes called asking me to come to the station because she had something to show me. The security footage from 5 different ATMs was lined up on her computer screen. My mother wore my clothes and walked exactly like me in every single one. She'd studied my mannerisms so perfectly that I couldn't tell it wasn't me at first. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear and how I always checked my phone while waiting. She even wore the same jewelry I always wore and carried my purse the same way. Each video showed her withdrawing the maximum amount while perfectly imitating me. My father called while I was still at the station and his voice sounded hollow. The doctors had Linda in a medically induced coma because of the infection risk and pain level. He wanted me to come see her even though she was unconscious, but I couldn't do it. We argued and he said family doesn't abandon family no matter what they did. I hung up on him, which I'd never done before. Agent Carr called an hour later saying the substance was definitely ricin and highly concentrated. He explained she probably extracted it herself from castor beans based on her internet history. The searches went back 4 months with detailed research on extraction methods and lethal doses. She'd ordered the beans online and had them shipped to that P.O. box. The planned murder was absolutely premeditated, and she'd picked the spa because she could control what I ate and drank there. My phone started buzzing with texts from friends who'd seen the news, and they were all remembering weird stuff about my mother that suddenly made sense. Sarah texted about how my mom always insisted on coming to every single doctor appointment I had, even for basic checkups when I was 22 years old. Katie remembered my mother grilling her about my prescriptions when I had strep throat, asking for exact dosages and refill dates. More messages kept coming about how she'd show up at study groups uninvited, taking notes on who my friends were and memorizing their names and details about their lives. The pattern was so obvious now that I couldn't believe I'd missed it for years. Detective Haynes called me back to the station the next morning because they'd found more evidence. The Postal Service had records showing my mother rented that P.O. box 6 months ago, and she'd used my forged signature on all the paperwork. They pulled surveillance footage of her collecting mail there twice a week, always wearing sunglasses and a hat, but clearly her. She'd been getting my bank statements, credit card offers, even my medical school correspondence sent there instead of my apartment. The postal worker remembered her because she always paid in cash and avoided conversation. I spent the next 2 days calling every bank and credit card company I could think of, and each call revealed more fraud. Capital One had a card I never opened with $8,000 in charges. Chase had 2 accounts in my name that were maxed out. Wells Fargo showed cash advances I never took. The total kept climbing past $50,000 as I found more hidden accounts, and each discovery made me physically sick. Every customer service rep I talked to had to file fraud reports and freeze the accounts while I faxed police reports and affidavits. 3 days after the attack, I finally went to the hospital to see my mother. They wouldn't let me in her room because of infection risk, so I had to look through the glass window. Her entire head was wrapped in white bandages with tubes coming out everywhere. The nurse said they were doing skin grafts, but the damage was too severe for full reconstruction. Even through all the bandages, I could see the shape of her face was wrong, collapsed in places where the flesh had dissolved. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but mostly I just felt empty watching her chest rise and fall with the ventilator. Detective Haynes had been going through my mother's laptop and found years of emails to her friends complaining about me. The messages started when I got into medical school. Angry rants about how she gave up her nursing career to raise me, and I owed her everything. One email from last year said she deserved to live my life more than I did because she made all the sacrifices. Another one detailed how unfair it was that I got opportunities she never had. The detective printed out dozens of these messages, each one more bitter than the last. That afternoon, Nina Ortega from Victim Services called to introduce herself and explain what would happen next. She had a calm voice that made me feel less crazy as she walked through my rights as a victim and how the legal process would work. She warned me both cases would take months or maybe years to resolve, and I'd probably have to testify multiple times. She gave me her direct number and said she'd be my advocate through everything, making sure I understood each step. Having someone whose only job was helping me felt like the first good thing since this nightmare started. The social media situation exploded when someone identified me from the restaurant videos and posted my name online. My Facebook and Instagram were suddenly flooded with friend requests and messages from strangers. Some people called me lucky that Mason saved me. Others said I must have known what my mother was doing. Reporter requests filled my inbox, and people I hadn't talked to since high school were suddenly reaching out for the inside story. I had to make everything private and eventually just deleted the apps from my phone. Even going to the grocery store became awful when I noticed people staring and whispering. One woman actually came up and asked if I was the girl from the acid attack video. A week after everything happened, I went to Mason's arraignment even though Nina strongly advised against it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and Mason looked wrong in the orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed. His lawyer, Dorian Glass, argued that Mason acted in defense of another person and should be released on bail. The prosecutor said throwing acid was excessive force regardless of the circumstances. Mason pleaded not guilty and kept trying to make eye contact with me, but I couldn't look at him for more than a second. Seeing him like that, knowing he was there because he tried to save me in the worst possible way, broke something inside me that I couldn't name. After the hearing, Detective Haynes pulled me aside and mentioned Mason might cooperate against my mother in exchange for reduced charges. The idea of them making deals about what happened to my family made me angry enough to punch the wall. She explained they needed Mason's evidence, especially the surveillance footage he'd collected of my mother. Without his cooperation, proving the full extent of her crimes would be much harder. 2 days later, Agent Carr called with the lab results confirming the ricin was concentrated enough to kill within hours if ingested. He said my mother had been researching poisons online for 4 months before settling on ricin because it was hard to detect in an autopsy. She'd specifically chosen the spa weekend because she could control everything I ate and drank, probably planning to put it in a smoothie or tea. The agent had traced her research through library computers and internet cafes where she thought she was being anonymous, but they'd recovered everything. My father called me that same afternoon and asked me to come over because he'd found something while going through old paperwork in the basement. I drove to their house and found him sitting at the kitchen table with stacks of documents spread everywhere, his hands shaking as he held up a folder. He'd discovered power of attorney papers from last year that my mother had convinced him to sign by saying they needed them for insurance purposes in case something happened to either of them. The documents gave her complete control over all his financial decisions and medical care, and he'd signed them without reading the fine print, because he trusted her. His voice cracked when he admitted he never questioned why she insisted on handling all their banking after that, never wondered why she started picking up his prescriptions, never thought twice when she said she was organizing their finances for retirement. Detective Haynes showed up at the house the next morning with a warrant for my mother's electronics, and immediately found something on her laptop that made her call for backup. The computer had hundreds of audio files where my mother had recorded herself practicing my voice for hours at a time, repeating my most common phrases and my laugh over and over until she got them perfect. I listened to one file where she said, "Hi, I'm Beatrice," at least 50 times in a row, each attempt getting closer to my actual voice, and another where she practiced phone conversations with my friends, using their real names and inside jokes she'd memorized. The detective played another recording where my mother rehearsed calling my medical school to request time off, matching my speech patterns so well that even I almost believed it was me talking. She'd studied me like an actor preparing for a role, breaking down my mannerisms and vocal quirks into notes she could practice, turning me into a performance she could master. The files went back 2 years and showed she'd been preparing to become me long before she got the ricin, long before she planned the spa trip, maybe even before she started stealing my money. That's when it hit me that the mother-daughter spa weekend she'd been pushing for months was never about bonding or celebrating my graduation like she claimed. She'd already told her friends I might stay an extra week to decompress after the stress of medical school applications, had mentioned to neighbors that I was thinking about taking a solo retreat afterward, had even called the spa to ask about extended stay packages. Nobody would have questioned my absence for at least 10 days, giving her time to dispose of my body and start her new life as me. Nina called to check on me after hearing about the voice recordings and strongly advised against visiting Mason in jail, even though I kept thinking about what he'd said about my father. She reminded me that anything I said during a jail visit could be recorded and used in court, that seeing him might re-traumatize me, that I didn't owe him anything just because he'd exposed my mother's crimes. But I couldn't stop wondering what else he knew, what other secrets he'd discovered while watching my family fall apart. So I called Dorian Glass and asked him to arrange a meeting. He agreed, but warned me 3 times that our conversation would be monitored and could affect both criminal cases, that Mason might say things to manipulate me, that I should bring someone for support, but my need to understand everything outweighed his warnings. The jail visiting room was smaller and colder than I expected, with scratched plexiglass between us and phones that smelled like disinfectant. Mason looked thinner in his orange jumpsuit, with dark circles under his eyes and healing cuts on his face from where my father had beaten him. He pressed his hand against the glass when he saw me, and I could see he'd been crying before I arrived. Dorian sat next to him with his laptop open, and Mason told him to show me the security footage he'd collected from cameras he'd hidden in my parents' house after following my mother there when she was supposed to be at her book club. The first video showed my mother crushing pills and mixing them into my father's coffee while he was in the shower, carefully stirring until the powder dissolved completely. Another clip from a different day showed her switching his blood pressure medication with sleeping pills, pouring the real pills down the sink and refilling the bottle with sedatives that looked almost identical. Mason had footage from 6 different occasions over 2 months, each showing my mother drugging my father without his knowledge, sometimes doubling or tripling the dose when she needed him particularly compliant. The lawyer pulled up a spreadsheet Mason had created tracking my father's symptoms against the drugging incidents, showing how his confusion and fatigue perfectly matched the days my mother gave him the highest doses. After the visit, Nina met me at a coffee shop near the jail because she could tell from my voice on the phone that I was falling apart. She sat with me while I ugly cried into my latte and reminded me that Mason throwing acid was still assault, that violence wasn't justified even if it exposed worse crimes, that I could be grateful for the truth while still being traumatized by how I learned it. She helped me see that I didn't have to forgive Mason or thank him or feel guilty about him being in jail, that my feelings about everything were allowed to be complicated and contradictory. She scheduled extra therapy sessions for me and gave me worksheets about setting boundaries with people who hurt you, even when they claim they were protecting you. The pharmacist from the CVS near my parents' house confirmed to police that my mother had been filling prescriptions for my father using 3 different doctors who'd never actually seen him. She'd forged his signature on the prescriptions and paid cash to avoid insurance records, rotating between 5 pharmacies so nobody would notice the pattern. The pharmacist remembered my mother specifically, because she always came alone and got nervous when asked routine questions about the medications, claiming my father was too sick to pick them up himself. Detective Haynes pulled records going back 18 months showing my mother had filled prescriptions for enough sedatives to keep a horse unconscious, all supposedly for my father's anxiety that he didn't even know he had. The hospital ran comprehensive blood work on my father after learning about the drugging, and found levels of 3 different sedatives that he'd never been prescribed by any legitimate doctor. His actual blood pressure had been dangerously high for months because he wasn't getting his real medication, and the sedatives had been masking symptoms that could have killed him. The doctors started a careful withdrawal protocol, monitoring him round the clock as they slowly reduced the chemicals my mother had been flooding his system with for over a year. He had seizures on the 3rd day of withdrawal, his body so dependent on the drugs that stopping them too quickly could have been fatal. Police executed a search warrant on my parents' house and found the tracking software Mason had mentioned installed on my father's laptop, phone, and tablet. My mother had been monitoring every email he sent, every website he visited, every call he made, with the data backing up to a cloud account she controlled. The software logged his GPS location every 5 minutes, recorded his passwords as he typed them, even activated his phone's microphone to listen to his conversations when she wasn't home. They found logs showing she'd been tracking him for 3 years, reading his texts to his brother about feeling confused, watching him search for symptoms of early dementia, knowing he was scared about his memory problems that she was causing. In the garage, investigators discovered receipts from 4 different online retailers for castor beans, the plant used to make ricin, ordered over 6 months using prepaid credit cards. She'd bought chemistry equipment, including a coffee grinder, filters, and acetone, everything needed to extract the poison from the beans. They found her handwritten notes on extraction methods copied from chemistry textbooks she'd checked out from 3 different libraries, complete with temperature requirements and safety precautions. In a locked filing cabinet, they discovered she'd been testing the poison on mice she bought from pet stores, keeping detailed notes about dosages and how long each mouse took to die. The preparation had taken months of careful planning, and she'd even researched which autopsy tests might detect ricin, so she could make sure I'd be cremated before anyone suspected murder. The medical school admin office called 3 days later, needing official paperwork from the police about why I couldn't start classes. I sat at my kitchen table trying to write the formal request letter, but my hands kept shaking. The words looked wrong typed out like that, all clean and neat, describing how my mother planned to poison me. Detective Haynes helped me get the right case numbers and signed forms saying I was part of an active investigation. The school approved a full-year deferral after reading the police reports. 2 weeks after the attack, I finally found a therapist who dealt with family trauma cases. Her office had soft chairs and boxes of tissues everywhere. I tried to explain what happened, but mostly just cried for the whole first session. She kept saying things like this went way beyond normal family problems, and I wasn't crazy for feeling destroyed. The therapist gave me homework to write down 3 feelings every day, but I could only write confused over and over. Detective Haynes called me in to review witness statements from the restaurant. My uncles both told police they heard Mason screaming that my mother was going to kill me before he threw the chemicals. 5 other people eating dinner said the same thing in their statements. The detective said this could really help Mason's defense lawyer argue he was trying to protect me. She showed me security footage from outside where you could see Mason pacing back and forth for 20 minutes before coming inside. The prosecutor's office sent a thick envelope with court dates and warnings about what would happen. Nina came to my apartment to help me understand all the legal papers. She explained both defense teams would try to make me look bad on the stand to help their clients. We practiced answering questions without getting emotional, but I kept breaking down when she asked about my mother. Nina said the cross-examination would be way worse than practice, and I needed to prepare myself mentally. 3 weeks after the attack, the hospital called to say my mother was awake. The police had guards outside her room every hour of the day and night. Her lawyer wanted to do the arraignment right there in the burn unit since she couldn't be moved yet. Even with her face wrapped in bandages and facing life in prison, she told the judge I betrayed her by not being grateful for everything she did. The judge set bail at $5 million, which nobody could pay. Federal prosecutor Autumn Fitzpatrick met with the state prosecutors to figure out who would charge what. She took the ricin case since that was federal while the state handled the identity theft and fraud charges. They warned me this meant 2 separate trials that could take years to finish. Autumn seemed really confident about getting a conviction with all the evidence they found. A reporter from some newspaper called my father saying she had information about my mother's past. She claimed there were sealed records from another state about similar problems 20 years ago. My father hung up on her, but we both wondered what else my mother had hidden from us. The woman we thought we knew our whole lives never really existed at all. I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for every door in my apartment. The locksmith found scratches showing someone had copied my keys recently, probably my mother. I also installed security cameras that sent alerts to my phone whenever someone came near my door. My father moved into my spare bedroom because neither of us felt safe being alone anymore. We jumped at every noise and checked the locks constantly. Mason's lawyer sent over his psychological evaluation for me to read before the hearing. The report said he had impulse control problems from stuff that happened when he was a kid. Dorian Glass wanted to use this to explain why Mason acted so extreme, but said it didn't excuse what he did. Reading about Mason's childhood trauma made him seem more human, but didn't change the fact that he destroyed my mother's face. The prosecutor explained that even with cooperation, Mason would get 5 to 10 years for assault with a chemical weapon. Dorian said this was actually pretty light considering the permanent damage he caused. It felt weird that the person who saved my life would go to prison while also knowing he had to. 3 weeks later, I sat in a small office downtown, while a financial advisor spread papers across his desk showing all the damage my mother had done to my accounts. He pointed at each fraudulent transaction with his pen, explaining how she'd opened credit cards in my name and maxed them out buying stuff she returned for cash. The total damage came to almost $60,000 when we added everything up, and that didn't count the legal fees that would pile up trying to fix it all. He said identity theft recovery could take years and warned me to check my credit report every month from now on because sometimes new accounts showed up months later. My father sat next to me going through his own stack of papers, discovering accounts he never knew existed and loans taken out using their joint assets as collateral. The advisor kept shaking his head and saying he'd never seen family identity theft this organized before. We spent 4 hours documenting everything for the police and filing disputes with every bank and credit card company. My hands cramped from signing affidavits and fraud reports. The advisor said we needed to freeze our credit immediately and change every password and security question on every account. He gave us a checklist that ran 3 pages long of all the steps to protect ourselves going forward. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him as he realized how much control my mother had taken without him noticing. 3 months after the attack, I walked into the courthouse for my mother's preliminary hearing feeling like I might throw up. The bailiff led her in wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands and feet shackled, and they had to help her into the wheelchair because she couldn't walk properly yet. Her entire head was wrapped in white bandages with only her eyes and mouth visible through small openings. She turned those eyes on me the second she entered the room and didn't look away once during the entire hearing. The hate coming through those bandages was so strong I could feel it from across the courtroom. The prosecutor laid out the charges while my mother sat perfectly still, except for her hands gripping the wheelchair arms so tight her knuckles went white. When the judge asked how she wanted to plead, she said not guilty in a voice rough from all the surgeries on her throat. Her lawyer argued for reduced bail, but the judge kept it at $5 million after hearing about the ricin and the identity theft. My mother kept staring at me even as they wheeled her back out. That same week, my father went to a different courthouse to file divorce papers and get a restraining order. He showed the judge threatening letters my mother had sent from jail saying she'd destroy him for abandoning her when she needed him most. One letter described in detail how she'd ruin his reputation at work and make sure everyone knew what a coward he was. Another one said I'd poisoned him against her, and that we'd both pay for our betrayal. The judge granted the restraining order immediately and said the divorce would be finalized whether my mother participated or not. My father seemed relieved when we walked out, but I saw him crying in his car afterward. He'd been married to her for 28 years and was grieving someone who never really existed. Mason's preliminary hearing happened 2 weeks later in the same courtroom where my mother's had been. Dorian Glass argued that Mason had acted to prevent a murder and protect me from immediate danger. He presented Mason's surveillance footage and bank records as evidence that my mother posed a real threat. The prosecutor countered that vigilante justice couldn't be tolerated regardless of the circumstances. Mason sat quietly through it all, only speaking when the judge asked him directly if he understood the charges. The judge took an hour to decide, but ultimately ruled the case would proceed to trial. Mason nodded like he'd expected this outcome. Dorian told me afterward that they'd keep fighting, but Mason had already accepted he'd serve time. A month later, I had to testify at another hearing for my mother's case about the identity theft and poisoning plot. Her lawyer tried to make me look ungrateful, asking if my mother had paid for my education and supported me through college. He suggested I was exaggerating the threat because I was angry about some stolen money. I kept my voice steady and stuck to facts about the bank footage and the ricin and the forged documents. The prosecutor had warned me this would happen, but it still hurt hearing someone twist everything to make me the villain. My mother watched me the whole time with those eyes burning through the bandage holes. When I finished testifying, the judge said there was enough evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. The burn surgeon met with me and my father to explain my mother's condition and what came next. He showed us charts of the damage to her face, pointing out where the acid had destroyed muscle and nerve tissue that could never fully heal. She'd need at least 30 surgeries over the next 5 years just to rebuild basic facial structure. Her nose was mostly gone and would need complete reconstruction. One ear was so damaged they'd have to build a prosthetic. She'd never look remotely like she used to and would have constant pain from nerve damage for the rest of her life. Part of me felt sick hearing this, but another part thought about her planning to poison me and felt like this was justice. The surgeon said she'd already had 6 surgeries just to prevent infection and stabilize the wounds. 2 weeks before the trial date, Autumn Fitzpatrick called to say my mother had refused the plea deal they'd offered. 15 years with possibility of parole in 10 wasn't good enough for her because she truly believed a jury would understand why she'd done everything. Autumn sounded confident about getting a conviction anyway given all the evidence, but warned me the trial would be brutal. My mother wanted to testify herself, and would probably try to paint herself as a sacrificing mother who just wanted what was best for her daughter. The delusion ran so deep she couldn't see how crazy that sounded. 4 months after everything started, I went grocery shopping and saw a woman with my mother's exact hair color and build walking toward me down the cereal aisle. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe, and suddenly I was on the floor with people standing over me asking if I was okay. The manager called an ambulance, but I just needed to get out of there. I left a full cart of groceries and drove home, where I sat in my car for an hour trying to stop shaking. My therapist had taught me breathing exercises for panic attacks, but they barely helped. I didn't go back to that store for weeks. 6 months after the attack, I called my medical school to request another extension, since the trials kept getting delayed. My advisor said they could give me one more 6-month deferral, but after that, I'd have to reapply. All my classmates were graduating without me, starting their residencies while I was stuck in legal hell. Some dreams had to wait, but it still hurt watching everyone else move forward while I stood still. The school sent paperwork requiring updated letters from law enforcement confirming the ongoing criminal cases. A week later, the judge held a hearing about whether the 2 cases should be tried together, since they involved the same incident. The defense wanted them combined, arguing it would be traumatic making everyone testify twice about the same events. The prosecutors fought against it, saying the cases were too different, and combining them would confuse the jury. After 2 hours of arguments, the judge ruled they'd stay separate. This meant testifying multiple times and the legal process stretching out even longer, but the prosecutors said it gave them better chances of getting convictions in both cases. 8 months dragged by with endless court dates and paperwork before Mason finally stood in front of the judge to accept his plea deal. The courtroom was packed with people I didn't know, but who apparently followed the case online. Mason wore a dark suit instead of the orange jumpsuit, and his lawyer Dorian stood beside him reading the terms. 7 years with possibility of parole in 4 if he stayed out of trouble and completed anger management programs. The judge asked if he understood, and Mason nodded before turning to face my mother and me. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused," he said quietly while looking at the floor. "I let my fear override my judgment, and I take full responsibility for my actions." My mother sat in her wheelchair with bandages still covering most of her face and didn't react at all. I felt relieved it was finally over, but also weird about the sentence because 7 years seemed both too long and not long enough. 2 weeks later, my mother's federal case wrapped up when Autumn called to say she'd accepted a plea deal rather than risk life in prison. 15 years in federal prison with no chance of early release for the first 10. She had to pay back everything she stole but had no money left after legal fees ate through her savings. The judge asked if she wanted to make a statement, and she stood up using a cane for support. "I gave up everything for my daughter and she owes me," she said through the reconstructed parts of her mouth. "I don't apologize for trying to take what was mine." The courtroom went silent, and even her own lawyer looked uncomfortable. My father started his own therapy sessions around this time, and his therapist helped him safely reduce all the medications my mother had been forcing on him. It took months of careful monitoring because stopping some of them too fast could cause seizures or worse. As the fog lifted, a different person emerged from the sleepy man I'd known my whole life. He was more assertive and his thoughts were clearer, and he actually had opinions about things instead of just agreeing with whatever my mother said. We sat in his living room one night, and he told me he felt like he'd been underwater for years. "I keep thinking about who we could have been without her controlling everything," he said while looking at old photo albums. We both cried because there was no way to get those years back. I spent weeks working with specialists to reclaim my identity and get new documents my mother couldn't access. The Social Security office required extra verification, including fingerprints and multiple forms of ID before issuing a new card. Getting a new passport meant bringing court documents proving the identity theft and waiting while they verified everything through special channels. Every bank account needed fraud alerts and extra security questions that only I would know the answers to. The DMV made me retake my photo and issued a new license with enhanced security features. Each document took forever to process, but slowly I rebuilt my official existence from scratch. My father and I decided to clean out my mother's belongings from the house since she wouldn't need them for at least a decade. We found boxes of photos in her closet that made my stomach turn. She'd printed pictures of me from social media and covered them with handwritten notes about my mannerisms and speech patterns. One photo from my college graduation had arrows pointing to how I held my hands when I talked. Another showed me laughing with friends, and she'd written down the exact sound of my laugh phonetically. Mixed in with these creepy study materials were pictures from my childhood when I was 5 or 6 years old. In those photos, she looked like a normal mom pushing me on swings or helping me build sandcastles. The grief hit weird because I mourned the mother I thought I had while being disgusted by who she really was. Nina helped me file official no-contact orders that would activate when my mother got released from prison. The paperwork spelled out that she couldn't come within 500 feet of me or try to contact me through third parties. Nina explained that we needed to plan for that distant future, even though it felt unreal to think about my mother as a free person again. "Some threats never fully end," Nina said while we reviewed the documents. "You need protection in place before she gets out." A full year after the acid attack, I walked back into my medical school building with my hands shaking. My therapist had prepared me for this moment, and a few close friends who knew everything met me at the entrance. Other students definitely stared and whispered when they saw me, but I kept walking to my first class. My advisor had arranged for me to join the current second-year class, so I wouldn't be completely alone. The professor welcomed me back and then launched into a lecture about cardiac medications. I took notes and tried to focus on the material instead of thinking about everything that had happened. During lunch, I sat with my friends, and we talked about normal stuff like exams and residency applications. My life was moving forward even though the scars from everything would always be there. I'd reclaimed my name and my future, but both carried permanent marks from what happened. Mason saved my life through violence that would keep him locked up for years. My mother tried to steal my existence through violence that destroyed her face forever. I survived both of them, and now I was building something new from the pieces that remained. All right, that's a wrap on today's little journey. Really appreciate you hanging out and wondering through all this with me. Hope to see you back here again soon. Like the video, it helps more than you think.